to Requiem Metal Podcast, Episode 6, Enslaved. Welcome to Episode 6 of the Requiem Metal Podcast. I'm Mark Rudolph.
And I'm Jason Hundy.
And we're joined with our special guest today, Mr. Jeffrey
Kuhn.
What's your middle name now?
Alexander.
No, not that one. Your middle name.
My middle name.
Come on.
Wasn't it Grindcore Kuhn?
Grindcore Kuhn, I guess.
Okay.
Yeah. It's been a few years.
Stoner Kuhn somehow ends a different sort of tag that he doesn't really want. Even though he's a stoner metal expert, he's not a stoner.
Not the
himself.
traditional stoner.
I'm a clean man. That's
clean living.
Clean living. So. But this is the metal podcast you've come to know and love, maybe. But it's just basically where usually it's just the two of us sitting around kind of talking about our thoughts about certain bands and the genre. But we always try to make a little bit more not intellectual, but more NPR version of a metal podcast.
Sure, it's definitely more academic, I would say. I don't think there's anything wrong with that.
So for these next couple episodes, we're going to be joined by Grindcore Kuhn. So today we're going to be talking about Enslaved, kind of a near and dear band to Jason's heart here.
Yeah, and the last episode we did, of course, was Immortal, and I was kind of talking to Mark that what Immortal represents to him, sort of like his sort of black metal-ish type band, because I don't really consider Immortal traditional black metal, as well as Enslaved. Enslaved is sort of that band to me. I've always was sort of really into those guys in a profound level, and I've kind of followed their career and really sort of gone along with their progression. Both the early era, the middle era, I think we'll talk about later, but some of us actually all kind of fell off for a while from Enslaved, because I think there was just so much going on in metal outside of black metal at that point.
I agree. Yeah.
What's your take on Enslaved, just for you personally?
Geez, of all the bands that came out around that era, I think they're probably one of the most inventive. I think they have every single Enslaved record takes a totally different direction. As you go from album to album.
Sure. And there's actually kind of like three eras in a way of Enslaved. There's sort of the early Viking metal, atmospheric black metal type stuff. And then there's this really sort of transitional period where they start to flirt with progressive metal. And then in the next episode, we'll really be getting into some of the more progressive elements and almost like Pink Floyd meets Bathory kind of designs that they sort of finish, they're not done yet. It's a career, but they're currently in.
Even going back and doing like research, listening to different albums for this episode, even though as different as the albums get, there's always a consistency, a weird consistency in everything, which is kind of
they seem to keep their unique style on every album, but flirt with different tempos, different production values, all kinds of things like that.
Yeah, it's not like an Arcturus where you go from, you start out with like symphonic black metal and then you just get completely crazy off the deep end kind of stuff. There's some kind of logic to their progression.
Sure.
So.
Although for Arcturus, that's about as logical as it gets. When Garm's sort of the fuel of your fire, that's what sort of happens.
Carnival metal or whatever,
yeah.
But I think the first place we probably need to start with Enslaved is, they came out, I'd say they're probably part of the first sort of really big wave of black metal that sort of started with Mayhem and Dark Throne and Immortal and Enslaved and Emperor, kind of all part of that. Ulver probably as well, and Marduk, I guess. Was Marduk part of that first wave, would you say? Those are the lights.
They're kind of on the, if you want to go true Norwegian black
that's
metal.
That's true, they're
really
Swedish, so. Yeah. But Enslaved sort of blossomed out of that, but they weren't doing as much of the satanic stuff as you hear, from some of the other bands, and as well as Immortal. Immortal kind of, stayed away from that stuff.
I like to refer to it as Norwegian gospel music.
Yeah, Norwegian gospel music. They were more rooted definitely in some of the Bathory-isms of Viking culture. They were definitely inspired by what I think Bathory had done with Hammerheart and
Under the
Blood,
Sign
Fire,
and
Death
stuff,
and Under the Sign. And that's sort of where Enslaved was sort of coming out of, this representation that, the Viking culture was somehow sort of lost, the Norse, religion and the Norse people, and that, the Norwegian, I guess, area, or even just the Viking area of Sweden, Denmark, Iceland, had really sort of lost touch with some of those roots when it became Christianized. And so they were sort of trying to go backwards and trying to find, you know, their roots and all of this sort of stuff. And so, you know, you can't really talk about Enslaved without talking about the Viking, you know, aspect. I mean, in some of their early records, of course, they're sort of most well known for dressing up in these hokey costumes sometimes.
But they're all, I think even on the back of Eld, they have, like, they even credit the guy that did all their outfits and swords and everything. So.
And I don't want to call it hokey, but I think to a naysayer, maybe an American metal fan, it seems so strange.
A jeans and t-shirt guy looking at a guy, you know, decked out in chainmail and a sword with a helmet on might look a little goofy.
Not exactly our heritage. If
Exactly. But again, you know, black metal was a lot about aesthetic. You know, I mean, even though they weren't traditional, like, you know, church burning, you know, black metal. I mean, they still had their own, you know, feel and their own sort of look that they were going for. It wasn't corpse paint, but you know, they were
very stylistic compared to a lot of the other stuff coming out at that time.
Well, I think Amon Amarth seems like they've kind of grabbed on to that whole Viking metal thing more so than Enslaved, as far as like having that being their publicly known kind of thing. But they're Swedish as well. So.
Sure, exactly. And I mean, all those bands sort of carry kind of a common heritage. And one of the things that is interesting, because as those of you who have sort of listened before know, you know, my background's with history as a history teacher, and I'll get into how I use Enslaved in the classroom a little bit later. It's kind of interesting.
That's a new program.
Yeah,
Enslaved in the classroom.
Enslaved in the classroom. But one of the things that's interesting about ancient sort of the Vikings, when they would before they would attack villages and things like that, the night before, oftentimes they would camp near the settlements they were going to attack, whether it was a Christian monastery or some other thing. And as tradition sort of goes, I don't know if this happened every single time, but there's certainly examples where they would sort of light campfires, and then the warriors would sort of gather around the fire and do these sort of guttural chants and like grunting and stuff like this.
To kind of psych out the enemy.
Yeah, it's psychological warfare to like psych out the enemy. And so, you know, when you take that element, you know, out of the past, it makes so much sense of all the, not only just the black metal that was coming out of Norway, but all the Swedish death metal. And I mean, King Diamond, you know, his shrill stuff that was sort of coming out of Denmark. And I mean, Scandinavia has always sort of been known, and even northern Germany and Germany in general with Creator and all the German thrash stuff has always been known as being a sort of heart of metal. And I think it traces back to some of the historical roots, and it's kind of interesting that Enslaved was trying to bring those to light.
They've got a lot of, like, you know, national folk elements kind of, or Norwegian folk elements put in, but not to the point of, you know, being like Captain and Tennille meets metal kind of stuff. It seemed like it had a logical progression as far as it, like, incorporating those traditional themes into, like, you know, extreme guitars and everything. So
absolutely. And you know, they sort of kind of built their early reputation on sort of longer kind of epic songs that were trying to capture sort of these elements of, you know, Norse religion and Norse sort of characteristics, and they'd write a lot of songs about battles and Thor and Loki and you know, Fenris and all these just, you know, different types of Viking sort of cultural elements. And you know, especially like their first record, it's only 5 songs, and I think
first one's 16 minutes. Living Under the Hammer, 16 minutes.
No, that's 793. It's 16 minutes. I think Living Under the Hammer is like 12-ish.
Is it?
Yeah, somewhere around there. But you can check. I'm not for sure, but I do know that.
You're
I do
hear
know
it coming up. So.
Yeah, the 793.
Get your stopwatches up.
Yeah, come on, folks, let's go. But anyways, in these early years, from the first couple records that we're going to play some of their music off of, you know, I was sort of commenting to these guys before that it seems like Enslaved in terms of the lyrics and stuff. They're not only just writing about Viking stuff, but they're really sort of concerned with nature, you know, which was a really big element of black metal.
Yeah.
And then really kind of getting into talking about like sort of the earthly elements of like earth and fire and ice, and you know, I mean, they're, you know, Frost, their second record is you know, ice, and their third record was Eld, fire, and it, you know, they're really sort of rooted in that. And then years later, in their later years, they really sort of get cosmic almost,
existential,
you know?
metal.
Yeah. So it's kind of a strange transition they make there. So
even going from the first record, production value wise, the first one's got a warmer feel, but then Frost, I don't know if it was just out of whimsy or if it was actually like thought out this way, but it has a really like cold and very high gain, and
absolutely. And I would say, and you know, Eld, that we'll talk about later too, is almost like uncontrollable, like things sort of flying out of nowhere. It's almost got a battle feel to it in a lot of ways, and fire, sort of raging. There's a real passion and rage, which of course is associated with fire.
They got a new drummer on that record too, which kind of opened them up to another sound as well. So,
but speaking of members, we should probably tell you a little bit about the core roots of the band.
Her pronunciation.
We're gonna apologize ahead of time with some of the song titles and things, because in the first few records they really only wrote in Icelandic, Old Norse,
Norse,
Norwegian stuff. But the core makeup on the first couple records, the lead singer and bass player was is it Gruntel? Is it
Grutle or Grutle?
Yeah, Grutle Kjelsen, I think would be how you pronounce that.
We'll just call him Grutle.
Yeah, you care to try the other guy here?
That would be Ivar Bjornsson on guitars, and he did it says here electronics and piano, but
and then
keyboards, obviously.
Then Trim Torsen.
Drums and percussion.
Who went on to Immortal Fame with Emperor.
Yeah, there you go. And
now in Zyklon. So.
Yeah, now he's the drummer for Zyklon. And these were sort of the core guys in the first couple records. And it's interesting. You mentioned Trim, who will eventually kind of go on and be part of Emperor, because if we're going to talk about the early days of Enslaved, Enslaved sort of was famous for their two kind of split albums that they had. Mm-hmm. One was Satyricon, who we'll talk about the connection musically between Satyricon and Enslaved a little bit later, which was the Forest is My Throne, Yggdrasil. Yggdrasil. And I can't remember what Yggdrasil means.
It's like a tree of... I was actually going to do a comic book related thing, so I did a bunch of research. Of course, I don't remember, but it was basically kind of like a tree of life and death kind of thing.
Oh, okay. It
was like some mythical thing that was like
yin yang for Vikings or something.
So.
Okay, that's cool. Mm. So like a Viking yin yang, I guess. But and then their second record, their second split, was a split with Emperor, and there's always sort of been this connection, I'd say, with Emperor in some ways. Right as they're putting out sort of their dynamic, sort of atmospheric keyboard record, which is their first record, here comes Emperor with, I'm drawing a blank, their huge one, the one before Anthems. Nightside, and the Nightside Eclipse. Okay, I don't know why I do. And then,
a lot of information here.
Yeah, a lot of information we're trying to pull out. And then, right along that time, by the time Emperor sort of went through their next big transition, Enslaved was going through their next transition with Eld, which was a totally, strange record.
Very much followed each other.
Yeah.
But in totally different ways musically.
Exactly. And that came out the same time as Anthems, and that's when Emperor really opened their sound up.
On their production value. And I think Enslaved's always kind of kept... Everything seems more organic and natural to me than Emperor, sometimes a little bit...
Well, I was going to say, right at Anthems is where they, I think, go in totally different directions.
Yeah, very much.
I think at that point, Emperor said to themselves, we're going to be more technical, more technically proficient. And Enslaved was kind of loosened up their sound to the point of experimentation.
I think that that technicality that because I remember Isan talking about how he just do like scales all the time. I think that informs your music sometimes to not such a great degree. Like with Enslaved, it sounds like they started out playing like when they're 13. Obviously, they probably weren't 100% proficient on their instruments. Same kind of with Immortal, but they used that the inability to play guitar to their advantage, just to I can't really play this chord, but maybe I can do this and do it faster. And they almost did their own vocabulary for the record. And I think there's something to be said about that than just being technically proficient, but being inventive.
Sure. And I know, Jeff, you've told me before, maybe you could tell them that, you read an interview once with the guitar player from Deftones, and he sort of talked about how he didn't know anything about guitar. And
so sometimes that's when you have to invent your own sound. Sometimes you go in very unique, different ways. That, don't, come up, on the same level.
Sure.
It's like an Emperor where later on they get very technical.
Oh, absolutely. Almost like composed.
They're orchestrated or something.
They're musical.
Which works for them. I don't want to slag Emperor because I'm a huge Emperor fan, but it's, Enslaved just has this warmth, like you said, this organic nature that was always sort of bubbling. I think it really starts with the roots of their sound, which was, rooted in this idea of elements and nature, which a lot of the black metal bands were doing, but Enslaved wasn't going for like the basement sound, like Dark Throne.
They weren't going for the ultra grim sound, and they do a lot of sliding around on the neck, and it's just really really organic, really. It's not just like when you think of like a Burzum riff or like a Darkthrone riff, it's just kind of like
that's razor sharp.
Yeah,
sort
just
of
repetitive.
stuff.
But these guys went up and down and had like a really full sound, really full guitar sound, and everything just seemed to kind of go together just perfect.
Sure, absolutely. And that split they recorded with Emperor was called the Hordanis Land, and then that sort of led them into releasing the first record, to my understanding, which was aptly titled. Well, actually, it doesn't have a title, but it's sort of been known by legend as Vikingligr Veldi.
I believe so. I think that's how it's pronounced.
And just on the cover, it's got some old Viking helmet.
Yeah,
I don't think there's a face in there. It's hard to tell, really. It's
it's one of those almost full face covered helmets where you have like the face guard and the nose that comes down. But
it's one of those covers you could stare at for a while and kind of be like, "What the hell am I looking at?" But and again, like we said, it was 4 core songs that were about 10 minutes long, and then 1 instrumental. And it's pretty epic. And the album opens up and really informs you of sort of the band's sound. It opens up with a tune called Lifande Undir Hamri, which was living under the hammer, correct? Mm-hmm. And I just remember hearing this for the first time. I had a cassette tape that Chris, a common friend of ours, had made, which had this album on one side and Ulver on the other side, Bergstad, their first record. And if you've never heard Ulver, that's why they're laughing, because it's sort of a strange, band in general. But again, it just captured this whole new sound, and I think they really integrated keyboards probably as well as anybody alongside Emperor at first into black metal and tried to show you, how you could sort of create all this.
Well, the choices they used as far as the keyboard tone. It wasn't this real operatic thing. It was almost an electric piano-ish sound that really kind of fit in with their instruments. It didn't jump out like a lot of, like some early demo stuff totally wants to sound like a symphony, but they can't afford it.
Yeah, exactly.
So they do like the next best thing, but yeah.
And this, I think, informs us of like their prog elements that are going to come out later. You know?
I think the one thing very interesting about a lot of Enslaved's keyboards is they more just accent the guitar rather than, like you said,
trying to be their own instrument. Like Demo, it's almost like, oh, he's on lead keyboards right now. Like Children of Bodom,
where
kind of stuff.
It's twin leads back and forth between the two instruments, but
and then that's sort of what kind of lends them the sound. And the only thing I could compare, like in terms of this sort of cosmic keyboardy sound at first, was almost what Arcturus was trying to do on their first record. Arcturus is more up front with their keyboards because
keyboard is kind of like a lead instrument over the guitar almost to a degree.
Yeah, but I get a more cosmic feel from Enslaved than I do say like a Demu. And Arcturus was the same way. It was
Demu's like operatic.
Celestial. But we're gonna hear a couple tunes off this. We're not gonna hear the full songs because they're so long, and we want to be able to get through.
Plus, we want you to go and buy the records.
Yeah, exactly. We're not here to bootleg Enslaved here for you. But we're going to hear the Lifande, the Living Under the Thor's Hammer tune. And then the second track, which, by golly, I'll give a try here. Vetrarnótt?
Sure.
Sounds German. I don't know. It's probably some...
Stille Nacht.
Yeah, it's something crazy. So enjoy a couple songs from Enslaved's debut. We just heard a couple tunes from Enslaved's debut, Vikingligr, Veldi. And Mark, tell us a little bit about one of the observations you had about some of the sounds of that first track there.
Yeah, this was going back. I mean, I haven't listened to the record in a good 3 or 4 years, but after listening to a bunch of like newer Satyricon, like Volcano and Post, forget what the hell the other couple were called now, but basically the last like 3 Satyricon records, you go
Diabolical.
back. Diabolical now, and but actually going back and listening to that first Enslaved record again, there's a lot of similarities as far as the breakdowns, the song structures, basically when Enslaved slowed down, which they didn't do a ton on the first record, but whereas it was more groove based, has a little bit of that biker metal feel to it, but
which will really become prominent in Enslaved's career later.
Yeah, it was just kind of weird to hear that Satyricon sound that many years before they went on to, because they were completely polar opposites at this point. But
sure, exactly. What are your memories of sort of like what's the first stuff like you kind of got into, Jeff, with Enslaved? Like, do you remember?
It was probably around. Actually, probably the first stuff I heard was like around the Eld era, and then kind of backtrack from there with Frost, and got into a lot of the first early stuff.
Sure. Do you have like a particular era that's like your favorite today, or?
Yeah, I would say Eld, Frost, and the 2 or 3 albums after that are the kind of. I think that's when they fully formed their sound, really.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And those ones, they had a lot of great epic tracks in them, and a lot of diversity as far as
Yeah, they were kind of like all over the place,
Yeah.
which is kind of cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. Like it's kind of hard to. I kind of have an appreciation of like all the eras. They do different things for me. It's almost like the different bands. It's kind of like what you were talking about with Immortal. There's sort of like the cutoff Blizzard Beasts, and then the At the Heart of Winters sort of eras. There's like a cutoff line there, and you can appreciate both. I think for what it is.
Yeah, I mean that's one thing I will say about them is, geez, every time they put out an album, it's always like a standalone.
Yeah.
You can really enjoy.
I don't think they've really retread.
No,
they seem like they always got a bunch of energy, and
they're sort of like what were we saying, like the anti-bolt thrower, something like that. Like just where or they just don't do the same thing on it, or the anti-dark throne is I think what you call them. Yeah,
yeah, you know what you're getting with a dark throne on an AC/DC record, but
you don't know Enslaved.
The genesis.
But anyways, we're gonna kind of jump back into where Enslaved starts to, I guess I would say, really fine tune their sound a little bit more. They start editing themselves, writing like more reasonable song length type songs, and they kind of put out, I would say, their sort of traditional proper record, their first traditional sort of proper record, which would be Frost, which is kind of a cool Osmos Records, which is who put Immortal out, as well as Enslaved, starting with this record, really did a nice job with the designs on Frost. Jeff and I both used to have, he still does, I lost mine. We used to have the really cool copy of this, which sort of they kind of like put a frosty looking Enslaved logo on the outer sort of plastic,
the jewel case,
the jewel case,
very cool,
and a really classy sort of production value and a good, nice promotion for the band. And in the background, it's just sort of this icy, mountainy landscape,
fjord,
little fjord action, and so it looks pretty cool. But this record, I would say, was really defined almost by one song that really sort of stuck out, and it's a song we won't hear because we're going to play other songs that kind of have elements of it, but it would be the Yggdrasil song, which was like almost like what Ulver did with their second record, which was all like sort of folk songs from Norway. This song is like, they play like a Jew harp at the beginning and all these sort of weird traditional, ancient instruments, and kind of turn it into, like you said, like a Viking spiritual of some sort. Yeah. And that's like sort of the centerpiece of the record. But the other element, that you mentioned before was sort of the cold sort of sound that's sort of working on this record. And a band that really picked up on some of the dynamics that you hear on Frost and almost made an entire sort of like career out of is Sweden's Dissection. Mm-hmm. And,
like listening to this stuff, it's been a couple years since I've listened to these first couple Enslaves, and like hearing like, wow, that sounds like it came off, Somberlane or something. And, that had been like came out 2 years after the fact.
Sure.
So
a lot of their clear channel guitar playing and sweep picking type things. I mean, do sound very much like a Somberlane or a Storm of the Lights band type thing.
Absolutely.
Yeah. It's funny to make these connections 10 or 15 years after the fact.
Yeah, because at the time, you're sort of almost caught in a vacuum. There was so much coming out in this era. You didn't have time to sit and make those sort of connections. But
that's the good thing with the podcast. We actually get to go back and kind of reflect on these things and maybe even think about them a little bit more. With better scope of music in general than we have in the past. So.
Absolutely. And here, one of the bands that really, I think, informed Enslaved sound, that we mentioned before, is Bathory, and you can start to really, again, hear the folk elements of that Bathory start to integrate, with
Hammerheart.
With Hammerheart and stuff like that, really sort of kind of climbing into the sound here. And I think one of you guys was mentioning earlier when we were listening to some of this stuff, that it almost sounds like they're playing black metal songs through the sensibility of acoustic folk music or something, and it really adds a different layer of sound to what Enslaved was doing.
Yeah, it comes back to that whole that kind of amateur quality when you're not a 100% proficient musician. You just kind of play whatever sounds cool.
Yeah, and that helped these guys develop organically, really, in a strange way. They didn't, I feel like with some bands, again, not to pick on Emperor, but Emperor really had a plan, almost like they, I could almost see a band meeting and Isan sort of laying out, okay, this is what we got to, here's what we need to achieve.
Well, it almost dictates where you're going to go, because if you're playing, all these standard chords and progressions, that's the obvious place that you can go. But then if you're, with Immortal, I think if they would have had better, been more developed musicians, perhaps they would have went in a different era instead of having this kind of weird, almost parallel to Enslaved to some degree. Not quite as experimental, but they both really stuck to that initial core of what made them unique to begin with.
That thread of music is always running through.
Unique note choices, unique ways of guiding a song much differently than going from a nice acoustical or clear channel part to crazy blast beats.
And you'll hear that really, I think, more show up on this record for the first time, whereas the songs we heard on the last set were really sort of consistent, except for, of course, that really, amazing breakdown in the second tune where they're literally just playing the same riff sort of over and over, and Trim's just sort of blasting as fast as he can. What you're going to hear here is the songs sort of open up a little bit more, and they do sort of change dynamically.
But they do keep that uniquely to them and maybe a couple of their bands, but a lot of the time you'll hear, even with an Opeth, they've got a real formula to, okay, when we break out of the heavy part, this is kind of the mellow part. But they manage to keep that thread of consistency through the acoustic playing and right back into the more extreme stuff. So
Sure, absolutely. So, and I think the two songs we're going to hear are Fenris and, oh boy,
Isöders.
Is it Dronning or something like that? I can't remember.
I think it's just Isöders, isn't it?
Isöders Dronning. Dronning. And I wish we just had some nice translations.
New York grinning.
Yeah, something. Does it have translations? No, I don't think it does.
No, I've got an old version of the what is this? This is just a promo that I ended up making a jewel case out of.
Yeah.
It's kind of limited on information.
But anyways, the record came out in '94, and right kind of on the back of Vikingligr, which I think Vikingligr was recorded
earlier,
Vikingligr came out on Euronymous' label,
Deathlike Silence Productions.
Yeah, and so I'm sure there was some possible complications with getting that record out after he was stabbed, of course, a few times. So, but anyways, enjoy these two songs, and see if you can pay attention to listen for those dissection elements and some of those other things that maybe you've heard before. heard a couple tunes off of Frost, the second full-length record from Enslaved, and we're going to move on to, I think, their first really transitional record, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, I would.
They kind of
probably the most fully formed, I would say, at that point. I mean,
yeah,
as far as
they were really getting some weird ideas out and kind of taking them to their furthest extent. You know?
Yeah.
And that's Eld, which means fire, as you heard us mention before. And Eld came out like 96, 97.
It's had a very ridiculed cover as well. It's got Gritla sitting on the front in some big oaken chair.
Yeah, and he's got the Thor's hammer kind of on his chest. And you know what? In hindsight, though, like, this is cool. This is much more interesting than all the crazy designed corpse paint that people were trying to innovate on and stuff. Yep. I mean, Slave was sort of carving out their own thing, and in a way, they helped sort of create a new genre, which, this sort of Viking metal genre that, bands like Einhire and Allegiance and Vintersorg and Borknagar, and probably most famously today, I'd say, is Amon Amarth, and even for a while, Satyricon kind of, flirted with sort of the Viking, sort of Norse mythology. And then, Jeff, you mentioned a band that sort of you hear a lot of elements in.
Well, Agalloch from Oregon,
of all places,
came on around that time.
Yeah, there's probably a lot of Norwegian immigrants in Portland, Oregon, or something. I mean, who knows? But so it's this is really where not only image or sound wise, but image wise, they're really starting to embrace the sort of the Viking sound and stuff. And I think the probably most telling aspect of that is the opening number, which for a lot of people is sort of the ultimate enslaved song, probably of their first kind of era. And the name of the song is called 793, Slaget Lindisfarne, and it's the Battle of Lindisfarne. And the year 793 is sort of when it happened, and it's essentially when the Vikings kind of forced their way into contact with the mainland Europeans for the first time, and sort of laid waste to the site of Lindisfarne, which I think was some type of Christian monastery, if I'm not mistaken. And this is sort of when the Vikings began like the 200 or 300 years of sort of running amok throughout Europe and ransacking it. Yeah. And earlier we sort of mentioned that I use this song in one of my classes. I teach a world history class, and I'll put the song on and shut off all the lights.
This is the Enslaved in the classroom.
This is the Enslaved in the classroom. And I shut off all the lights, block the windows, and we light up some candles, which really gives the kids with asthma quite a problem. But I tell them,
hand out your battle axes.
Yeah, exactly. Hand out the battle axes and such. But it's kind of neat, and I play the song, and I don't tell them what it is. They don't even know that we're studying Vikings that day, and then I have them sort of like do a free association rite with this, and it's pretty neat, some of the ideas that they come up with, because they hear some of the elements that you hear in the intro of this song, which is like
very evocative of a soundtrack, really.
Oh, absolutely. So, it's almost like got a Braveheart feel or something to it, where you can hear them paddling, you can hear them going across the water, you can hear them sort of chanting. You can almost imagine them like row, 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 and then of course there's sort of this mid-pace part for about 3 or 4 minutes, and I get the feeling
like
that
march to
march to battle, and then like the second they hit shore, like I get this image of the scene in Return of the King from Lord of the Rings when the boat shows up and they all just like hop over the edge and just start kicking the crap out of everyone, and it turns into a real battle. And the two songs we're gonna play from here, besides 793, we'll also hear another tune called A Long Time Ago.
Well, in 793, we're gonna I think we're gonna fade out a little bit into it.
It's kind of 16 minutes long,
prohibitively long. Yeah.
But both songs really are evocative of battle. And one of the things that I was telling these guys earlier is that if Bolt Thrower is the sound of modern war, then Enslaved definitely encapsulated or captured what medieval warfare sort of sounded like through music. Yep. Sort of the clanging swords and shields, and again, soundtrack kind of music is what they're creating here. And I think maybe that's where this album, for some fans, it's a bit uneven at times, because they're trying to experiment and do like a lot of things. And I think, not to make any generalizations, but I think sometimes, especially in the black metal scene, there's a sort of a conservatism that sort of exists amongst a lot of the people.
Oh yeah.
And
akin to Republicans.
Yeah, and yeah, exactly.
That's a gross
there you go.
generalization, but
again, and some people didn't really like what Enslaved was doing here, because it was like too.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's those people that just wanted to hear their, the first two Burzum records, and then everything had to sound like Dark Throne. It had to be as grim and as quote unquote true as possible, and
there's
this was right around that era when everybody was, picking sides on that.
Exactly, and this is a really warm record. I mean,
very much, yeah.
Really nice production values on it. It sounds more like they maybe got it produced by somebody that doesn't traditionally do death metal records.
Sure, which is strange because it's actually the same guy, Python, that had done all their previous records. I think really it's Trim had left at this point to join Emperor on drums, and they bring in this guy who's only on one record, but in a way, he's almost like liberates Enslaved.
He has much more swing to his beat. It's a jazzy feel, or
absolutely.
Sometimes
it's not as
like
blasty.
It does almost have like sort of like a like a bio. Just kidding. I was going to say bio. Tales from the heart side. Slave are really speaking from the heart, from Viking to heart side.
But no, the drum sound, it does sound like he's playing a different kind of kit. It's got a warmer kind of pop to the snare and.
Absolutely. Whereas like Trim, it just really sounded like he was just beating the hell out of like.
I'm not sure if Trim used triggers or not. You'd almost have to some degree. But
were triggers that common back in the early '90s, or did that come more in the late '90s?
I think for recording, basically all a trigger is you're just it's sending a signal. You're still playing it. It's just like a little sensor underneath the drum head. From what I know, it goes back into a brain thing that kind of produces the sound, but.
Because I know like Demu and Cradle and some of those bands are more sort of trigger bands, Yeah,
I kind of doubt Trim did, but he was just kind of a force of nature behind the kit. It was unbelievable.
And then, of course, you hear what Trim does later, like on Anthems. I mean, like some of the stuff he does there is just, it's like, windswept through you. But the name of the drummer was Harold Halgelson, just so so we don't leave him out. So we're going to listen to a pair of songs here. Anything to say about Eld? I mean, you mentioned the last talk, so this is sort of one of your personal favorites. This is really,
really just, it has a lot of, like I said before, a lot of epic stuff. And one thing I knew, the guitar sound started to thicken out on this album and really kind of progress further on that way. Whereas before it was, Frost and previous Blodhemn even had a tinny kind of sound to it.
Yeah.
Kind of thin, high gain sound, yeah.
Exactly. Which was sort of, traditional black metal, but this is, again, where they start to move that other direction. And so enjoy these two songs. And a long time ago has some really neat sort of like elements going on for it that maybe we'll talk about afterwards, with some chickens and some other things sort of going. It's definitely medieval, so...
Gerast mér nú hvítingar þessi hvimleiðir, þeir sækja okkur heim ár hvert. Og þennan hyggst ég drepa.
Welcome back. You just heard, a couple tunes off of Eld there, including one of my personal favorite, a long time ago, which there's even like that solo feels like that they're beating the hell out of each other as they're playing that solo, and the drums are flying all over the place. It's kind of neat.
Very battle metal.
Yeah, exactly. Battle metal with Bal Saga. Remember that awful
by Bal Sagat.
Yeah, it was bad stuff. And they almost took that sort of like energy and battle sort of mentality to their next record, and right from the very get go of the cover, which is again them in
Fothergale, yeah, Blodhemn, which is I think translates to blood vengeance.
Yeah,
that's what it is.
So they're definitely
this is a record that I think a lot of us didn't have.
Yeah,
when it first came out, this was an era that I wasn't really listening to much. New stuff that Enslaved was coming out. So I think the first time I've ever heard this was this last 3 years ago. But then I just got it and I just threw it on my shelf until today.
Yeah.
Beforehand, so throw it on a little bit, and a lot of this stuff really holds up really well. It's almost like Battles in the North. I think you have to be in this. You have to listen enough of this stuff to be able to kind of hear more of the stuff that's going on. Because it's a really crazy record as far as the speed. Just
very fast.
Yeah, it's really like breakneck speed. But they do kind of start a lot of the more the catchy breakdowns, the more like jazzy, bluesy rock solos and stuff kind of starts showing up on this record. So,
and we get a really important element for Enslaved in terms of sort of their band members is Dirge Rep from Gehenna has finally comes over to replace Harold Helgeson on drums. And Dirge Rep's still there drumming today, right?
What's that?
Is he still drumming with Enslaved today?
No. They've on Isa and Rune they have a new guy.
Is that right? Okay, so for like 3 or 4 records, he's sort of the guy though, and he helps sort of inform their new progression of sound.
It just seemed like he interjected a little bit of like rock and like catchiness into the drumming. It wasn't just this wall of like manic noise like peppered with splash cymbals and all this kind of stuff. He was capable of doing that, but even with Gehenna, he had it just seemed like he was more rooted in rock for some reason, but then
for sure,
the traditional black metal sound.
And I think what's weird about this record, maybe one of the reasons I didn't get into is I think when we saw Enslaved at Metal Fest, I think that was 99, and I think it was Metal Fest 99. I'm almost positive.
Yeah, I think it was.
And it was right after this record had come out, and that's I think what they played a lot live. And I think for me, I wanted to hear some more like the more sort of breathable songs off of Eld, which were more epic
they play
and stuff.
Living Under the Hammer?
They opened with Living Under the Hammer, which excited me greatly, but then they really played a lot of like just fast songs. And if you remember right, like that Enslaved played at the very end of the night, and we had just seen like Anathema, Opeth,
an unbelievable
Children of Bodom. I mean,
good
it was
bands in a day,
and it really
digest.
And I think it kind of wore me out, and I think I kind of walked away with a little bit of a bad taste from Enslaved in some ways. And it has nothing to do with them; it's not their fault. I think it was just a sort of a psychological.
12 hours
aspect.
of metal in one day is too much. As far as standing there live, having to.
And I think a lot of us dismiss that record because of that, because it was just sort of, that Blodhemn is just fast. That's all it is. It's not. There's no dynamics.
Everybody's
to it.
it's the junk record. It's where they just kind of like lost their way. But
recently I've gone back as well as you have. And have you had this record before?
No, I one of my old roommates actually had it. Listened to it quite a bit back then. He was a big Ulver fan as well, and I'm trying to think of the name of that Ulver album that was just.
Oh, Nathan's Madrigal. It was,
to me,
Transylvanian Hunger, Dark Throne kind of stuff.
Cutting the patch cord.
It was almost to me like comparable to that, where they took the direction where
just
they're just
fast for the sake of being super fast.
But if you want to go by a thematic, descriptor again, the blood vengeance, it makes more sense.
Absolutely. And again, they're starting to come out of those sort of earthy elemental stuff, and they're starting to get more almost like psychological and metaphysical in terms of, you know, the next record, Mardraum, which we'll talk about, is Nightmare. You know, again, they're starting to talk about more sort of the psychology rather than like, you know, ice, earth,
yeah,
you know,
Vikings
fire,
fighting,
you know,
destroy, pillage.
You know, and this is sort of interesting. But we're gonna hear a pair of songs that you're kind of a big fan of.
As of today, so.
Yeah.
What is it? Urtical Gods?
And Ansuz Astral from Blodhemn. So enjoy a little pairing here.
we're back. We've had a couple cuts off Blood Vengeance.
Yeah, and then the last tune you heard after that, which was sort of more transitional, was actually a song called Dead Hymn, which has a Norwegian pronunciation, which I'm not even going to attempt.
We won't bastardize that one, too.
And that's actually from the next record, the last record we're going to talk about in sort of our Enslaved Part 1, which is Mardraum, Beyond the Within.
So it's Nightmare Beyond the Within.
Yeah, and again, this is sort of where, like we said, they're starting to get more psychological in terms of, getting away from the elements and moving towards the sort of psychology of the mind and, this idea of the nightmare. And they really get progressive on this record.
Yeah, they really kind of pull out the stops as far as, like, catchiness and songwriting, too. And a lot of stuff, it's not technically great. I mean, this is stuff I could probably do on the drums for the most part. On track 7, I'm talking. This is,
The Hive. Strangled by Purity.
That we'll hear in a minute.
Oh, wait, no, I'm sorry. The Ending Empire. I misread Roman numerals. As a history teacher, I should be, put on suspension for that.
No, but they're doing like really catchy. Sometimes more, it's like as catchy as like a Kiss drum beat to some degree. But the driving force behind the whole thing is just great. But they really kind of stride the line right here with getting, having like ferocity, but still having like a lot of catchiness, and there's just a lot of like just great songwriting going on here. I think they really kind of, this is the first where I feel like they really kind of came into their own, and you can listen to the whole record all the way through without there being like that like the wince song or anything,
Yeah. So. And again, like, even though they hit, the thing about Enslaved is they'll hit like high velocity sometimes, which can sort of be threatening to some people coming at Enslaved from not a metal background.
Yeah.
Because I think at this point, you could, those of you who maybe are newer to some of this type of metal, you'll start to hear some like deliciously catchy elements. Like you said, the drums and some of the more
the guitar breakdowns and stuff.
Yeah, they get a lot more proggy and stuff.
Yeah, some of it almost like there was a little bit of a thrash element added in before.
Yeah,
that
absolutely.
Wasn't in the past.
And I think it will be more listenable for some people, even though like it won't have that sort of just those. I don't want to call them obnoxiously fast black metal songs.
But it's more accessible to where you can hear what's going on. You don't have to try to like focus on picking out like
it's not Battles of the North or something like that. And I think it should be said that I think the guy who really brought a lot of this rock sensibility to them was Ivar, who really had always been one of the more principal songwriters, but I think they sort of shared a lot of the songwriting maybe at first. And
I really think on Blodhemn and on Mardraum, Roy Kronheim, great name.
Yeah,
came in as a second guitar player, and I think that might have infused. It might have either, the two of them, him and Ivar together might have like kind of, actually brought something else out of this. I think if he wouldn't have come into the band at this time, this is just speculation, but it seems like this was the right time to have another guitar player to bounce ideas off so they wouldn't become stagnant.
Absolutely. And, one of the things that's sort of interesting is they've gone to a new producer at this point, which makes perfect sense if you're talking about from a catchy angle.
This is the first one on Abyss Studios.
This is Abyss Studios, which at this point, in the late 90s, early 2000s, I mean, Abyss was really pumping out, Demu,
and this doesn't,
Dawn.
When you listen to this record, Immortal. It doesn't sound like an Abyss studio record.
No, but it does. It's very
the production,
well done.
It's very polished, well done, but it doesn't have that Abyss sound like you'd hear on some of the other black metal records.
Sure, absolutely.
And I think was it Lars Skoke? Is he the one that did the engineering and stuff on this as well?
Yeah,
okay. That's the drummer of Hypocrisy.
Yep, absolutely. But so, anyways, we're gonna close things out this evening, if you're listening in the evening, hopefully. From Mardraum, which again will sort of inform you of this direction that Enslaved is going to take it. Kind of a personal favorite of yours, which you already mentioned about the drumming, the Ending Empire. course, you just heard of tunes from Mardraum, Beyond the Within, Enslaved's, fourth record, I think. Fifth record, actually. Yeah, their fifth full length, which is really sort of marks this, I don't know, to me it's like the division of their career. You know, this is sort of the first really major creative peak in a way, and they're about to take a totally new transition and a totally new sort of style, which we're actually...
Well, this is aptly, this is the end of this episode of the podcast, and we're going to pick it up next week with Enslaved Part 2.
Yeah, so thank you, Jeff, for being on this one, and you'll be on the next one as well with us. So, but for...
pleasure being here.
Yeah, appreciate it, so...
Yeah, so for the Requiem Podcast, I'm Mark Rudolph.
And I'm Jason Hundy.
And if you have any thoughts, questions, quandaries, complaints, send us an email at requiempodcast@gmail.com. That's REQUIEM podcast@gmail.com.
And if you can score me a copy of Enslaved Frost with the little frosty cover because one of my Rugrat students stole it, feel free to send me an address. I'll pay for postage. So.